Okay, so our next speaker is virtual. It's Phillip Zapkin, an assistant teaching professor of English at Penn State University with a doctorate from West Virginia University. His primary scholarly focus is contemporary adaptations of Greek drama. Phillip's first book, titled Hellenic Common, Greek Drama and Cultural Cosmopolitanism in the Neoliberal Era, was published by Routledge last August. Congratulations. Phillip's essays have also appeared in PMLA, Modern Drama, Comparative Drama, Limina, and elsewhere. This is Phillip's first time presenting at CAMWS. His paper today is entitled Petrifyin Canonical Counter-Discourse in Shara McCallum's Madwoman as Rasta Medusa. And please give a warm welcome to first-time presenter at CAMWS, Phillip Zapkin.
All right. Thank you all for joining me, even though obviously I couldn't be there with you in person. And thank you to the organizers of the CAMWS conference and to you, Lily, for setting up this panel so I could speak with you all today. Also, thank you to you, Krishni, for giving us some great background on Medusa, which I cut out of this conference paper. So my paper is entitled Petrifyin Canonical Counter-Discourse in Shara McCallum's Madwoman as Rasta Medusa. Two quick things before I begin my talk. First, this argument is available as part of a recently published article in Humanities, and I'm happy to share a link in the chat or over email for anybody who's interested. Second, Shara McCallum has very generously provided a recording of herself reading the poem that I'm going to be discussing, so I want to start by sharing that poem with you. And this is where I will share my screen. And hopefully you all will be able to hear Shara's reading.
This is Shara McCallum, and I'm reading my poem, Madwoman as Rasta Medusa. I, woman, go turn all a Babylon to stone. I, woman, is the deliverer and the truth. Look pon I, and feel ye inside calcify. Look pon I, and witness the chasm, the abyss of yourself rupture. Look pon I, and know what bring destruction. You say I, woman, is monstrosity, but is your gravelicious ways make I come the way I come. Is your belief everyone exists for satisfy your wantonness. You think all these years gone I, woman, a come here for revenge? Oh, yo, but it's wrong. Again, you're wrong. I, woman, is the reckoning and judgment day. This face, etched with wretchedness, these dreads, writhing and hissing misery, is not the terror. I, woman, is what birthed from your terror.
All right. A lovely poem. So, in the colonial West Indian education systems, classics and British literature were taught in an attempt to overwrite the multicultural blending that marked the Caribbean. Of post-colonial authors coming out of this system, Helen Tiffin argues, contemporary art, philosophies, and literature produced by post-colonial societies are not simply continuations or adaptations of European models. The processes of artistic and literary decolonization have involved a radical dismantling of European codes and a post-colonial subversion and appropriation of the dominant European discourses. Tiffin theorizes what she calls canonical counter-discourse, which is a specific way that post-colonial authors write back to the colonial center by adapting materials from the European or imperial canon and turning them into post-colonial properties. Jamaican author Shara McCallum's poem Madwoman as Rasta Medusa redeploys the Medusa myth to challenge both imperialist and patriarchal ownership of the Gorgon's story. McCallum's poem engages in canonical counter-discourse, claiming a kinship with Medusa from a feminist and post-colonial perspective through the play's language and the agency given to Medusa by the speaker. Now, canonical counter-discourse is a subversive literary strategy which contests power structures that traditionally derive authority from Greco-Roman classics. And in the context of the West Indies, those power structures include both British colonialism and patriarchy. As Tiffin argues, however, canonical counter-discursive strategies involve a mapping of the dominant discourse, a reading and exposing of its underlying assumptions, and the dismantling of those assumptions from the cross-cultural standpoint of the imperially subjectified local. In other words, by drawing from classical material to challenge imperialist and/or patriarchal power structures, contemporary authors not only present sophisticated analyses of power structures and cultural capital, they simultaneously critique those structures. Madwoman as Rasta Medusa is published in McCallum's collection Madwoman, which deals with themes of dislocation, powerlessness, gender dynamics, and family life. Right from the beginning of the poem, it's clear that the Madwoman speaker takes on the role of an empowered and vengeful Medusa deeply embedded in Rasta theology. The opening lines of the poem are, "I woman go turn all of Babylon to stone. I woman is the deliverer and the truth." That's my bad Jamaican accent, which I should probably apologize for. These lines express a righteous fury rooted in the Rasta opposition to Babylon, a term referring to a wide variety of oppressive power structures, including British colonialism and the politico-economic power systems that suppress global South nations. The poem ends with promises of a divine vengeance carried out by Madwoman, which can be read as vengeance on behalf of the historically oppressed, colonized, and enslaved peoples of Jamaica. "I, woman, is the reckoning and judgment day. This face etched with wretchedness, these dreads, writhing and hissing, misery is not the terror. I, woman, is what birth from you terror." For Rastas, the word dreads may refer either to the dreadlocks hairstyle or to individuals who wear the hairstyle, particularly Rastafarians. And if we read McCallum's references to dreads as a synonym for Rastas, then this line can refer to primarily black Jamaican resistance to British or European culture and colonial authority. Now, British colonial education systems imposed Greco-Roman classics in British literature, culture, and language on the colonized West Indies. And so when Caribbean post-colonial authors like McCallum take up classical mythology or literature, they do so in ways that contest European cultural ownership of the classics. They engage, in other words, in canonical counter-discourse by writing back to the imperial center in such a way as to undermine imperial hierarchies. Emily Greenwood locates Caribbean uses of the classics in a loaded cultural encounter between colonizer and colonized, which accords with the motif in Caribbean literature, where the struggle for political and cultural autonomy is contested through the classics. This struggle often involves reimagining the position of the classics as such within hierarchies of cultural authority. And as Lorna Hardwick puts it, analysis of rewriting of classical texts in colonized and colonizing societies shows that there is a pattern of features that suggest a distinctive role for classical material in provoking awareness and transformation of cultural identities. In other words, post-colonial adaptations of the classics that write back to the imperial power or to the center of imperial power or culture often do so to contest that centrality. Now, the English language was used as a tool in Caribbean, as well as African and other colonies, to destroy locally rooted identities, and specifically in the case of the Western Hemisphere, to separate enslaved peoples from their native cultures, languages, and identities. However, the politics of language are not merely oppressive, but also facilitate resistance and the formation of new identities in the face of Anglophone imperialism. Madwoman as Rasta Medusa is written in Jamaican patois, a Caribbean English. Patois, along with other Creole Caribbean languages, was a language developed amongst the common people, often the enslaved or the downtrodden, which historically challenged the primacy of standard English by constructing new West Indian folk cultures. Cashman Kerr Prince calls this hybrid creation of new languages post-colonial philology, which he describes as breaking the customary order of language, reversing the accepted significations, marks a Creole writer's liberation from the hegemony of one language or culture, from the tyranny of a masterful imperial culture. In other words, by rejecting Standard English with its colonialist history and instead embracing a hybridized new language, post-colonial authors undercut the cultural authority of colonialism itself. Patois is evident throughout this poem. To take just the first line, "I woman go turn all of Babylon to stone." This is clearly Patois, clearly Rasta inspired. A Standard English iteration might be something like, "I, a woman, am going to turn all of Babylon to stone." But by using Patois, McCallum positions her speaker apart from the colonial power structures associated with Standard English. The threat to Babylon, which again in Rasta theology can refer to a wide range of exploitative power structures, including British imperialism, is actualized not only in the promise to petrify it, but is enacted through a version of English developed out of Jamaican folk resistance to British colonialism. By discussing Greco-Roman mythology in a Caribbean language, McCallum asserts a cultural connection to ancient myth, asserts that Caribbean culture is linked to antiquity in the same ways that colonial ideology would otherwise reserve for Europeans. Now, even as McCallum positions Madwoman Medusa as a destroyer with the agency to avenge wrongs, for instance in the lines, "Look pon I and know what bring destruction," the poem simultaneously accuses the you addressee of creating the supposed monster through greed and exploitation. The most direct indictment is, "You say I woman is monstrosity, but is you gravelicious ways make I come the way I come? Is you belief everyone exist fi satisfy you wantonness?" The you is gravelicious and wanton, selfish and lascivious. The you wants to consume, to exploit, to possess. Now, because the you is not clearly identified as a single specific subject, there are many possible interpretations that fit. This may be Madwoman as Jamaican, speaking back to the colonial and racial hierarchies of Babylon, which position Black West Indians as racially inferior. This may also be Madwoman speaking back to a specific individual man who has wronged her, or to patriarchy as a system that positions all women as objects. The speaker, after all, repeatedly identifies as I woman, with a clear gendered element to her righteous anger. In my reading, these interpretations are not mutually exclusive, but lend a richness and complexity to the poem as McCallum deploys the Medusa myth to undercut multiple dominant power structures, particularly imperialism, as we've already seen, but also patriarchy. There is a prominent tradition of 20th and 21st century feminist poets reclaiming the Medusa figure or story as symbols of empowerment, and thereby writing back to patriarchy by repurposing a traditionally patriarchal narrative. The tendency for feminist writers, especially during the 1970s and 80s, was to completely reimagine Medusa as a subject in her own right, one that often reflected the anger animating so much of second-wave feminism's struggle against gender inequality. This is part of a larger trend within canonical counter-discourse that Jeremy Rawson calls minor character elaboration, which he defines as constructing narratives around the perspectives of socially marginal figures in canonical works, often seeking to critique the ideologies underlying the manner in which these works represent minor characters, or their failure to present socially marginal figures at all. In this genre, authors identify characters who are silenced, sidelined, or otherwise peripheral because of their gender, ethnicity, or race, social class, etc., and they reimagine their stories, often writing from the perspective of those minor characters. Now, one limit to the actual efficacy of minor character elaboration, according to Rawson, is that feminist poets or writers who assume the persona of Medusa do not actually give the mythic Gorgon a voice. Medusa is not empowered to speak. There's only the illusion of that empowerment created by a modern author imagining her perspective. Now, I would argue that McCallum's poem avoids the trap Rawson identifies by using Medusa to help understand the speaker of the poem, rather than by directly identifying the speaker as Medusa. To be clear, the line separating the speaker from the Gorgon is very, very thin, but I think it's still present. While McCallum's poem is in first person, it is in first person from the perspective of Madwoman, a character who takes many forms and speaks with many voices throughout the poetry collection that bears her name. Because Madwoman shifts her identity throughout the collection, she may actually speak from the perspective of Medusa here, but if that's true, it's equally true that Medusa speaks from the perspective of Madwoman. The speaker of this poem is clearly Jamaican, clearly a mystic, clearly Rasta. She uses Rasta apocalyptic rhetoric. So this is therefore not the Medusa that we know from Greek mythology. McCallum has not attempted to speak for the Medusa silenced in Hesiod, Apollodorus, Ovid, and other early writers. Instead, McCallum's speaker blends her own identity with that of Medusa to illuminate shared experiences of oppression and exploitation. Now, Madwoman as Rasta Medusa is a poem with layers of meaning, which align it with both feminist and post-colonial canonical counter-discourse. Because modes of oppression, disenfranchising, and silencing frequently work along multiple planes, we must be aware of the multiple systems of oppression many subjects find themselves within. As a female poet of color from the Caribbean, McCallum faces multiple axes of historical forms of oppression, gendered, racial, geographic, and as an immigrant in the notoriously xenophobic United States. In order to effectively pursue the project of dismantling matrices of power and domination, canonical counter-discourse must be understood to be intersectional, resisting multiple axes of oppression within and between societies. McCallum's poem perfectly models this intersectionality. Thank you.